let's bring it back together. So I hope that was useful, informative, a good practice on what we're talking about with personas, scenarios, and storyboards. Feedback I got from the GSIs was twofold, and I saw a little bit of this while I was walking around myself. When we talk about being specific with personas, we really want a character that's kind of fully fleshed out, not just in relationship to the technology that we're talking about. So there were a lot of people whose personas out here were like, Bob is really into history and really likes time and also is a fan of machines. And like, I get it. Like, I get why you're going in that direction, but like, tell me something about this person that isn't about the technology that they're using, so that when some sort of decision comes up down the road about how they would interact with the technology, what the features of the technology should be, we have something a little more rich and robust to draw from than just something that was so narrowly focused in on like, Bob has always wanted to kill Hitler sort of things. Cool? All right, two, the storyboards looked really good, and a lot of people did really good work out here. There was a critique I heard repeatedly from the GSIs, though, that you may have taken the advice to focus on the big picture and context a little too far and not quite have gotten to how you actually interact with the technology at all. And so it's good to kind of have that in the middle. Like, get us to the, like, you know, Bob really wants to go back in time because he broke up with his wife and he wants to make it right. But then also show me him interacting with the time machine to at least some extent before we get to the like, yay, now I'm in the past and I can punch 20s Bob in the face, you know, sort of part of the storyboard. So you need, it's kind of those three components. It's like context and rising action, the interaction with the actual device, whether that means, you know, storyboards of particular interfaces, or if that means, you know, just some basic level of interactivity, like I'm going to push some buttons sort of thing, and then the sort of resolution of what is supposed to happen after they press the buttons. Cool? Great. Well, if you have any more questions about this exercise, feel free to ask on Piazza. The GSIs would be able to kind of flesh out your understanding of this a little bit further if you have any questions. So a little bit of administrivia before we dive back into content. Enrollment, allegedly we've begun to process the waitlist. I'm told that there were about 20 people-ish that were waitlisted and now are enrolled between 260 and 160. So if you haven't seen any action yet, keep an eye on it and hopefully things will update. It sounds like we are not alone in being frustrated with this new Cal Central nonsense thing. So if something wacky is happening to you on the waitlist, sorry, I have no idea. This is totally new to all of us, and it sounds like it kind of caught the CS department by surprise. If we haven't heard from you in any way, you'll be dropped. So if you didn't come to lecture last week and you didn't at least send us a note why, sorry, you're toast. If you don't turn in assignment 1, design assignment 1 on time, we're very likely to drop you. So if you know that you're going to be late on that for some reason, probably drop us a note on Piazza so that you don't wake up Monday morning with no CS160 anymore. If you're planning on dropping the course, just do that. Don't hang out until after week 3, because at the end of week 3, we're going to make the project teams. And if we know that you're not going to be here, we can avoid putting you on a project team. If you stick around through then drop the class, you screw everything up and we hate you forever, and we tell everybody not to admit you into 160 in the future. So don't do that. Cool? Fair warning, we are 2 weeks away from what is likely to be a required lecture. So I believe, I'm still putting the final schedule together, but I believe week 4, which is September 15th, will be a required lecture. So we will do a 2-hour exercise in class. I'll give an hour lecture on connected device design and the Internet of Things. And then we will do a 2-hour exercise where you will meet your group for the first time and start the process of brainstorming potential problems to solve. So you'll get your first group assignment that day and actually start working on it for 2 hours in class. So 2 weeks from today, you have to be here. If you have any questions, or if you want to keep up on announcements and assignments that are coming out, all of that's happening through Piazza. So make sure that you're signed up for that. My office hours are going to be over here-ish somewhere right after lecture. So if you want to talk to me, I'll be hanging out. And then I know it's kind of lame that I'm only up here 1 day a week, and I don't get a lot of opportunity to talk to people about topics that aren't administrative, because everybody just wants to talk about like how do I Canoma or how do I not waitlist and things like that. If you actually want to talk about like design and what it means to be a designer, I would like to have those conversations. And so I will plan on having some virtual office hours where I just get on Google Hangouts or something, and we can chat, during the week. Section, we're starting to trim down the list of sections. So if you haven't voted on Piazza for which sections you want to go to, do it now. I think this is the proposal for right now of what we're going to leave. So for some reason, you guys really like 8 a.m. sections because you're wrong. Fine, whatever. So we're going to leave one of the 8 a.m. sections, and then we're going to leave a noon, 1 o'clock, and a 5 p.m. just to have kind of coverage throughout the day, and hopefully everybody can get to one of those. If you can't make it to any of those, let us know sooner rather than later. Not generally required, but there will be a week or two where we want every group to check in at a section. So you should be able to attend at least one of them, whether you actually do so or not. Yeah. It would be nice. What we do usually is if you can't make it with your whole group, we just kind of say, okay, 2 of you go to one section and 2 of you go to another, and then we'll touch base between. This week, we're going to start talking Canoma.js in section. So over in that room over there, the GSIs are dutifully trying to learn Canoma.js from my developer evangelist. And so they will be prepared totally tomorrow, I assure you, and ready to kind of introduce you to the platform on which you'll be doing the technology for this course. Reading assignments. For next week, you'll be reading Chapter 1 of Poet, The Psychology of Everyday Things, also known as The Design of Everyday Things, which is this famous kind of pop design book by Don Norman. And then Chapter 5 from User-Centered System Design, which is a little more techy, academic, finicky paper about direct manipulation interfaces. So those 2 things for next week. We will have your first programming assignment out, published on vCourses today. It's going to be due at the end of next week. It is to build a little app that can convert between food and calories and vice versa. So like how many bananas is an apple and how many calories are 7 apples and things like that. So there will be some creativity involved in how you work with that. If you go to the developer resources section of Canoma.com, you can start learning, start reading the tutorials and learning through those. If you go there, like one of the very first boxes is Canoma.js tutorials, and that's the place to get started. And again, you'll start learning about layout and controls and widgets and things in section this week. Don't go nuts on this programming assignment. It's good and useful, and it's a good place to start, but don't kill yourself trying to make the world's greatest food converter thing. The point is just to kind of get you familiar with the language and framework. Individual design assignment 2 will be released shortly. It's going to be due September 13th, which is midweek, not quite 2 weeks from today. And that one is going to be about taking the results of your design 1 interviews and kind of going through one iteration of the design process, trying to come up with a solution that could solve some problem that you identified in design assignment 1. So you'll do a little brainstorm process, select one of those ideas, do a little paper prototype of it, and then test your little paper prototype with somebody out in the world, do an actual evaluation of your paper prototype. So it's just to get you exposed once to this whole process in miniature before we do the whole thing in big as part of the group project. And so there have been some questions on Piazza about workload and what are the expectations. Basically, this is what the workload looks like. There's going to be 3 individual programming assignments over the course of the semester. They get progressively bigger. So the first one is nearly trivial once you figure out Canoma.js. And the third one is a little bit complicated, but not horrible. There will be 3 individual design assignments. So you already know about 2 of them, the one that's due tomorrow and this one I just talked about. The third one will be an individual heuristic evaluation exercise that comes in the middle of the semester. Reading responses every week. Lecture and the studio in the middle of the lecture, the midterm, and then the big group project. So the big group project will be the majority of the workload for this course once it gets going. Schedule is progressively filling in on the website once I'm changing some of the lectures near the end of the semester, but we'll put up the rough draft of the schedule soon so you have some idea of what the pacing is. Midterm is probably going to be week 8, which I believe is October 13th, but don't hold me to that quite yet. It'll either be that week or the week after. Cool. So with all that said, I have 45 minutes to try to teach you about a topic that always lasts an hour and a half. So that's going to be awesome. Let's do it. So task analysis and contextual inquiry are up next. And what this is about is, I told you, you have to go out into the world and talk to people in order to figure out what they need. Task analysis and contextual inquiry are two different formalizations of that process. So you're not just kind of going out and randomly watching the world or talking to people. You're figuring out what people need in a slightly more structured way. We are inspired by this Yogi Berra quote here. You can observe a lot by just watching. And the main point here is that you can't just trust your intuition to make design decisions. It doesn't work that way. You can't just design something that you want, something that you need. You have to go out and kind of see what your users are doing in the real world, observe them, figure out what they need, and then use that information in context to inform your design. And so here is the concept of task analysis. And let's start by listening to this commercial from way, way back for a Xerox copy machine.
You're about to see an incredible machine. This is the A200 copier from Xerox. It feeds originals automatically. It gives you XL10 quality copies on both sides. It reduces, it collates, it even staples. Now, to operate a machine that does as much as the A200, you'll have to acquire some very special skills. You'll have to learn how to do this.
So that is a commercial that is roughly as old as me. And it was for this exciting new line of Xerox copy machines. And they made this claim that, with this new line of Xerox copy machines, all you have to do is press the button and it just magically goes. And it turns out that it wasn't exactly true. They were judged to be just wildly complicated by people out in the field, by customers. And Xerox looked at this, and the engineers who were working on this machine studied the machine and studied the complaints that were coming back from customers. And they came to what they felt was an obvious conclusion. What would their conclusion have been? They decided that most likely the user was dumb. Users are dumb, this is easy. Everybody should be able to do this. What's the problem here? Yeah. Suspicious, isn't it? They should have perhaps thought that something was wrong here. And yet, they kind of came to this conclusion that they were hearing from a vocal minority. And so they went out and they hired Lucy Suchman. And they said, you're an anthropologist. You are going to come into our research arm, which was Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. It's now just PARC, no longer directly affiliated with Xerox. And you're going to come out and you're going to help us figure out what the hell is going on here. Why are people completely incapable of using our copy machines? And she suggested that they go out and they just videotape people working with the devices. And they started by just photocopying people that were very convenient to them, people that worked at Xerox PARC, and at Stanford, which happened to be right next door. And here's a video of one such interaction.
Here, I'm going to just do this. Okay. Press start. What if I want a two-sided copy? There's a bunch of buttons here. So output paper tray, copy mode. One-sided. We want two-sided copies. Unload mistake. That wasn't a paper trail. I guess this was a mistake. And press start. That went into that. No, that's not the paper trail. That's not this. That's not the paper trail. It didn't say what the paper trail was. No. Wait a minute. But no, they have them, right? We only have the. We're gonna get two. Oh, it's 49 must be on the other side. Go back to work. Yes. These two pages missing. Right. It was a case we got halfway through, right? Yeah. We do in fact have, but there is, I don't see any two, hold on, I don't see any two-sided stuff. Okay, so this must be garbage. What is this? When you take a look at that, see if that's two-sided. This is not two-sided. I'm telling you, there's no two-sided pages around here.
So this is one of the video interactions that they captured of two quote-unquote average users playing with one of these copy machines and trying to make two-sided copies. And this blew people's minds when they brought it back to Xerox and showed it to them, because these two quote-unquote average users that they happen to capture in this video are two of the most famous computer scientists in the world. Alan Newell and Ron Kaplan, who are Turing Award winners, ACM fellows, distinguished scientists, Google types these days that are just incredibly smart, wildly smart people. And they brought this video back to Xerox and they said, look, you've got like two of the smartest people in the technology industry and they can't figure out how to make your damn two-sided copies. You need to do something here. And what the observation showed ultimately was that the problem wasn't that the user sucked, because it really almost never is, but that the interface was too difficult to read. It was too difficult to learn how to use the thing just by looking at the machine. And so they went through this big redesign process and they really reworked their copy machines as a result of this study that happened. There are lots of different ways to do these types of studies. So going out and kind of watching people in the wild, there are countless techniques for doing it. Ethnography and ethnomethodology is what we were just talking about there, where you kind of, you go out and you do these kind of unobtrusive, semi-structured interviews. When real anthropologists hear engineers talking about ethnography, they cringe a little bit because what we do is kind of a bastardized version of ethnography, but close enough. It sort of looks like ethnography. Task analysis and contextual inquiry, which is what we're talking about today. Cultural probes, diary studies, pager studies, and ESM techniques are when you install new technology in somebody's house and then ask them to repeatedly write down their interactions with it. So like every time you look at the clock, write down why you looked at the clock and what you did with the clock. These days, diary studies are often done with phones. So if you've ever seen one of these apps that like every hour or something reminds you to like get up and stretch or drink a glass of water or whatever, people run diary studies using things like that, where the phone prompts the user, like, have you used Cal Central in the past hour? If you did, what did you do with it? On a scale of 1 to 10, how did you feel about that interaction? That sort of thing. And so today we're going to talk about task analysis and contextual inquiry, the goals of which are to understand user activities in context to inform the design of information technology. And as a motivating example, I want to use BART. So we're going to do a quick task analysis of one task in the BART system. And the goals of this task are going to be to kind of interact with this ticket machine, to buy a new ticket, to add value to an existing ticket, and to pay using credit card, debit card, or cash. You've all used BART ticket machines before. Do you have any problems that spring to mind with such a thing? Yeah. Indeed. Yep, so the default add remove value button is a 5-cent button, which is super great. Yep.
I don't know what to do first, even though there's like a 1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really looking at the 1, 2, 3, so I'm like, do I put the money in first? Do I click something?
Indeed. So figuring out the actual process can be a challenge. And indeed, you can see part of the problem here, which is that these labels always aren't here. Like that one is already disappearing. And also, it's not actually true. Like you really do this first if you want to add value. So like they're showing you the steps for doing one particular process, but that may or may not be the process that you actually want to do. Yeah.
It's also like the first process maybe is putting in a build, but it's on the right side, and we read left to right, and it's just
Okay. So there's some readability problems to the machine itself. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, these things are like never actually there. That piece of paper, apparently people really want those because they're always gone. Yep. Yeah, so the buttons are labeled A through H for no particularly obvious reason, and they're not usually referenced on the screen. Brilliant. Yeah.
Going off that, it's quite confusing. I mean, what I oftentimes, as a when I'm trying to subtract $1 or subtract 5 cents, I'm adding $1 or adding 5 cents.
Yeah.
It's not easy to distinguish between the four options.
Indeed. They also have this parallax issue where the screen and the buttons don't always quite line up right. So when you're looking at it, it's hard to figure out what goes to what. Yeah. Yeah, so the button thing, I mean, do they still look like this? I haven't actually taken part in a couple of years. Okay, yeah.
also the instructions when you're using a credit card are different. Like I've always encountered like when I insert the credit card first and then try to buy a ticket, it never works. So like I have to first select the ticket and then
All right, so the way you would start thinking about how to actually improve this design is by going out there, understanding users' tasks, and thinking about who are the users and what do they want to do. Then you observe existing practices so that you understand the actual context, and then you use that to create your personas, your storyboards, your scenarios in a structured way that you can actually prove. You can go back to the product design people or the engineers or the executives at your company and say, yes, we know this is the right thing to do and we can prove it, and here's how. And so there's this big old list of 11 questions that are the canonical task analysis questions. This is useful. It's intended to be generative, not prescriptive. So this is not an absolute list of the things you have to go out and determine the answers to, but it's pointing you in the right direction. And so what I want you to do is, as I walk through these questions one at a time, think not just about the answers to them, but about the sort of categories, like how would you analyze these questions? And so when I ask you something like, who is going to use the system? What sorts of things do you think about? What do I mean by who? Give me some demographics or some categories or some dimensions on which we might care about how to classify our users. Yeah. Okay, so like what do they do for a living or how do they spend their time? Sure. Age. Okay, occupation. Yeah. Okay, technological competency. Gender. Language. Good. Yep. Okay. Yeah. How specific you can get about that is going to depend on what kind of technology you're building. But yes. All right, so things like that. Identity, background, skills, values, likes, dislikes, education level, literacy, ability or disabilities is a big one. Physical traits, height, weight, physical endurance, ability to do things, age, tourists versus people who use this machine every day, business people versus the elderly, people with ATM cards, people with credit cards, people with just cash, people with just quarters. How able are they in general? And then taking that and figuring out, like, how does it apply to this particular system? For BART, we're at some level are talking about mostly educated people. We're mostly talking about people fluent in English, although not always. Varying heights, can't be too tall, can't be too short. Mixture of ages, mixture of abilities, bike users. How do you accommodate people that are carrying heavy backpacks? How do you do this? How do you do that? And you can think, just sitting here in your head, about all of these different kind of dimensions along which you might be able to classify people that ride the BART system and that need to buy tickets from BART. But I want you to know that sitting here and imagining it and thinking through what those people might be like is distinctly doing this wrong, right? The whole point of task analysis and contextual inquiry and this process that we're building is that you're not supposed to just sit here and guess. You're not supposed to sit here and think. You're not supposed to imagine. You're supposed to go out into the field and actually find out. Sit at a BART station and observe. See what people are actually doing and how they're working with these interfaces. And just go out and see. And what I would encourage you guys to do is actually do this. Take a moment, pause and reflect, and just go out to a BART station and sit down. You don't have to bother anybody. Just sit down at a BART station and watch people and see how they use the system and see where they get frustrated and see what they look like and what they talk like and how they interact with things. And you'll be surprised. Just taking a moment to stop and consider the enormity of the diversity of your users may change your perspective on this problem a little bit. If you really start feeling ambitious, talk to people. Find out what they're doing. Walk up to people and say, I'm a UC Berkeley student. I'm doing this to learn. This is part of my education, and I'd like to talk to you about the BART system. And you'd be surprised. People are generally pretty cool with that. There's this feeling that students should be empowered to invade your life for the sake of their learning. So use it while you've got it, because when you're a professional and you start doing these things, people all of a sudden expect to start getting paid. They want their swag or their $20 gift certificate or whatever else. But really, I would encourage you guys to think about these things. Go out and watch people using technology, not just for our assignments, but just to broaden your perspectives a little bit on how these systems work. Next, after you have some idea who the people are and how that would drive the personas that you're developing, then you can start talking about what tasks do they perform and what tasks do they want to do. So you need to be able to keep track of what are people already doing, what would people like to be able to do in the future, and what do you as the designer, who ostensibly is better at figuring out what people need than the people themselves are, see in the world that could be improved. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you kind of spot those things. But for the BART system, we're talking about things like using cash, credit cards, debit cards to buy tickets, checking your balance, adding money to a ticket, getting destination tickets, these sorts of things. And your task analysis will vary based on the goals of your analysis. So if you're at the very start of this process and you're just kind of trying to figure out what are the basic scenarios of usage, then you might do this at a very high level. If you're really trying to dig in and say should this button be in this place or this place in the user interface, then suddenly you might be caring about a different granularity and really wanting to see the people using these things deep down into the system. Next question, how do you learn how to perform these tasks? What does the user need to know? Do they need training? Do they need to read a book? Do they have to have graduated high school to understand your system? That sort of thing. In the case of BART, it better be that you can just walk up and use it. And indeed, this is where the conflict around the BART system comes from, is that there are people that already know how to use the damn thing, and then there are people who just got off of out from the airport, never been to San Francisco before, excited to visit the Bay Area, and they stand there at the BART ticket machine, and then they are trying to train themselves by kind of working with the machine, but in the meantime, they've got pissed off people behind them trying to get to work. You'll note that this used to be a huge problem in the pre-Clipper card era, this conflict between people that had no idea how to use the system and people that were day-to-day users. Mercifully now with the Clipper cards, most of the people that actually know what they're doing are removed from this system, and it can just be like the tourists battling each other for the machine. But it has to be kind of simple and similar to existing systems. It should work more or less like a vending machine or an ATM, because that's how other people understand the world. They kind of can map something they already know onto this new system. You have to think a little bit about where the task is performed. So is it in an office? Is it in the lab? Does the environment have any effect? Is there a social influence to the place? Does it, due to social convention, need to be quiet? Do you need to be respectful? Is it a loud place like a bar or a nightclub? And what are the effects of other people on the system? And so for BART, we're talking about kind of loud, grungy panhandlers and musicians and people trying to go in different directions. And it's kind of a chaotic environment. And so what are some implications of that chaos? Well, one might be that probably voice I/O is not the best idea in a BART station. You probably don't want to have to talk to the ticket machine in order to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Privacy is a concern because there's always lines and crowds, and if it's really easy to steal your personal information from your interaction with the machine, that's going to be a problem. Lighting is often dim, so you have to worry about messages printed on things being difficult to read, signage being difficult to read, and then there's just all this stuff going on, just people everywhere doing the things that people do. And it's not kind of considered socially acceptable for your user to walk up to the person playing the guitar and say, like, I need you to stop that for a second while I read the damn sign. Like, you're killing me here. It doesn't work that way. And so your technology has to work in this environment. You can't expect your user to change the environment to work with your technology. All right, relationship between user and data and other tools that the user has. These are concerns about, like, where do you store the data? How do you keep track of things? How do you analyze the user's interaction with the system as a whole as opposed to just a single machine? So how does BART solve that problem on a technical level? User interacts with n different BART ticket machines in the system over the course of a year. How does BART handle the information exchange between those n different machines? The ATM system, for instance, has a central server where your account credentials go up to the cloud, and it knows how much money you have, and it spits out the money if you have the money and not otherwise. BART doesn't work that way. How does BART work? How many people here use BART tickets? Not clipper cards, but like actual BART tickets? Okay. Well, so how BART deals with this problem is that they store all the information on the BART ticket, right? So your card itself has an ID and a balance and information encoded in it, and that is actually the the data interchange mechanism for networking multiple BART machines, is that everything that they need to know is stored on the physical piece of paper itself. So in the BART situation that users can use any machine, the information is actually stored on the card itself. You have common data that applies across the whole system, so the fair rules apply the same everywhere. The whole system is used massively concurrently, so any solution that you were to develop that could only handle one user at a time in the system obviously wouldn't work. You have personal and private access to your information, like your ATM PIN or your credit card. And right now, originally at least, there was no need for remote access. That said, people now interact with the BART system not just in person, but also on their smartphone and from the BART.gov schedule and from printed schedules and from maps. And you might want to think about, how do we build out new solutions that take advantage of all of those tools? That's a good thing and a bad thing. And why I want you to think about this. Imagine that you came up with a solution for BART where you could improve efficiency on the BART system by 60%. Okay? But to get that 60% approval, everybody needs to have an Android or an iOS device. You can't ride the BART system anymore without an Android or an iOS device. Is that an acceptable solution in this space? No, probably not, right? Because we have this massive population of people that need to ride the BART system that don't necessarily have that tool available to them, that can't necessarily afford it or want it or have access to it or understand it or anything else. And so designing around the fact that not everybody wants to use a technological solution or wants to use the way that you think the world should work is part of task analysis and part of the design process. This is a problem that the world is going to struggle with mightily over the next few years when it comes to self-driving cars. So the world would be a better place kind of on paper, objectively, if everybody was required to have a self-driving car, for instance, because they could all communicate with each other and the roads would be perfectly safe and everything would be super coordinated and everybody would get to work happy and on time. But everybody that likes driving their car would be pissed royal and would drop out of the system and would object to this and would fight it and everything else. And so coming up with a socially engineered top-down solution often doesn't work, and that should be exposed through this type of task analysis. All right, how do users communicate with each other? How often are the tasks performed? This gets really important when you start doing social and groupware. So groupware is what we call communication software that gets used in an office or amongst a team. So I would call Facebook social media and Slack groupware, if you understand that distinction. But anyway, understanding kind of how people in the organization talk to each other is important for answering those types of questions. In the case of BART, it turns out that more or less people don't have to talk to each other all that much. But occasionally you have to facilitate interactions with the nice person behind the bulletproof glass who is there to yell at you because you did something incredibly stupid. And ultimately, what you should be figuring out here is just what is the common case? How do you make the common case fast? And then how do you make all the other situations possible? So optimize for the common case, make uncommon cases possible, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. And then the last couple of task analysis questions are just what are the time constraints on the tasks and what does error recovery look like? What happens when things go wrong? So you need to know what functions will customers be in a hurry for. It happens that on BART, that's like everything. Nobody ever really is leisurely heading to their BART train. Which things can wait? So if a task is like updating your credit card information, but it just has to happen sometime, maybe that gets deferred and that can happen on the mobile app, but actually loading money onto the card has to be really quick. In BART's case, customers are always in a hurry, lines form, you need to take less than a minute per interaction, and you really need to be able to do any task in any order because you can't really impose kind of a social order onto the system. And then in the case of what goes wrong, think about this one for a second. So when you screw up on the machine and you accidentally add $200 instead of 200 nickels, or you subtract $100 instead of adding $100, how do you fix those problems right now on BART? Yeah.
I think there's an option saying that
Okay, so there is a pop-up thing that is less an error recovery thing and more an error prevention thing. Be like, are you sure? Sort of dialogue. So there's that. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a big button somewhere in the UI that's just abort, start over. This is something terrible has happened. Cancel everything that I'm in the middle of. So there's that. And then when you really screw up, what do? You go and talk to the person, basically. Somewhere in the labyrinth, there's supposed to be a person, and they're scary and behind glass and peer out at you from time to time. But you, in theory at least, can go and talk to that person and get your problem fixed. So that's kind of the backup strategy. You can talk to people, you can hit the start over button, you can figure out different ways of interacting with the system. What is the biggest problem when things go wrong on the BART system and people are using the actual paper cards? You see this with tourists all the time. They don't have enough money on their BART card. What happens? So you're walking up to the turnstile. You put in your little paper card. You're walking up to grab it and walk through the turnstile. What happens if you didn't have enough money on the card? Doesn't open. So you go bam and hit the thing. What else happens? Okay. Tells you how much more you need. Comes back out back there instead of up here. So you're walking through and you're ready to grab the thing and it comes back out back there. Not good design. It's an unfortunate thing. So then you have to like turn around and push somebody out of your way that was trying to get on their damn Richmond train just so that you can go back and get your card and then go and add money to it. And so this is kind of the process. You go out, you have your list of questions, you observe people, you talk to people, you interview people, and you just try to answer those questions for as broad a segment of your audience as you possibly can. So you identify these tasks by collecting these materials. You try to come up with a list of tasks where the tasks are of these different granularities. And you do this mixture of kind of easy tasks, something like insert the thing into the machine and go through the turnstile, up to super complicated tasks like combine two cards into one card, or combine two cards and take money off of it, that sort of thing. These kind of infrequent or power user tasks. And the idea is that this is what your system is supposed to do. This is the kind of heart of design, is you're answering the question, what does this thing have to do? And all through the process of your design, from this very first step until your very last fully developed product that you're going out and evaluating out in the world, these tasks are going to stay with you. So you use this at every step of the process to say, are we solving this task? Are we building in our design? Are we building a thing that answers that task? And then when you go out and do your evaluation, you're trying to answer the question, does the task actually get resolved by using our system? Tasks are kind of formatted in the way of what the user wants to do, not how the user would do it. So they're supposed to be problem-oriented, not technology-oriented. So you say, like, user wants to add $20 of value, not user wants to use the touch screen and their debit card to get $20 extra value on the thing. You can be very specific. You can use your personas that you developed early in this process to say, like, you know, Julia wants to do X. And then you can do different tasks for different users. So sometimes your power user will have a different set of tasks in mind than your kind of very basic user. And this gives you this kind of push and pull of like, how do we optimize the system such that the everyman can do the things they need to do, but the power users can also get at their thing. It's a complicated problem, actually. So you write up your description of the tasks, you produce scenarios that cover each task, then you do your storyboarding exercise. So where this fits into the process that we did today is kind of all along it. You're trying to use your task analysis to generate personas, you're trying to use your task analysis to generate scenarios, and then also storyboards. And I think that's about all I really want to say about that. The idea is that you just eventually go from individual tasks to this kind of roughed out interface design over the course of, you know, what could be many weeks. So we have one more topic to cover today, which is contextual inquiry. But before we get there, any questions on task analysis? It's, again, just one of these processes that you have to kind of go through a time or two to get a feel for how it works. But you'll be surprised how wrong your intuitions are about these sorts of things. When you go out and you watch somebody doing something, especially something that you haven't personally done a lot, but even in that case, often you'll find that you'll be surprised how wrong you are about the way a system actually gets used. Question? No, the goal is just to get the job done, right? So the goal is to be able to produce personas, storyboard, scenarios and storyboards. And you don't have to answer every single one of these little sub-questions to get that job done. But you do have to really get a feel for who your user is and how your user works. And more than anything, it's about being able to just kind of discard whatever preconceived notions you have and be empathetic to who your user is, even when that user is perhaps very different than you are personally. That's really the goal of this whole thing. Thoughts, questions? All right, so in your marathon, like massive amount of reading I gave you this last go around, the Karen Holtzblatt's Contextual Inquiry, one of the chapters from that book, was in there. This is something of a, so the actual Contextual Inquiry book is something of a Bible for a certain class of designers. There are people that really, really deeply believe in contextual inquiry as like the one proper method for doing task analysis. You know, instead of just doing observation and interviews, they advocate this one really particular model, contextual inquiry. And Karen, by the way, is an interesting person, but she comes to lots of these design conferences. You'll see her at O'Reilly Design and at Kai and at all these different places giving talks on kind of how to do contextual inquiry, right? It's kind of her baby. But fundamentally, the idea of contextual inquiry is to go where your customer is, go where the person that's going to be using your product is, observe the customer as they work, and talk to them very interactively about their work. And your goal is to not just observe, but to get inside the user's head, see their work and their tasks the way that they see it, and really kind of meddle with the situation so that you get at the extremes, so that you see not just like the day-to-day, but also what happens when things go wrong, what happens when things are a little bit wacky, how do you work within this system when things aren't the way they're supposed to be. And the fundamental concept is this master-apprentice model, and it's this idea that you are coming in and asking the person who does the job, who uses the tool that you're going to be building, to literally teach you to do their job. And the reason that you're doing this is that it can be really, really hard for somebody to sit down and write out a description of what they do for a living, or how they interact with a system, or why they work the way that they work. But if you're just sitting there with that person for hours and hours and hours, and contextual inquiry is a long process, and you can ask them, why did you do that? Why did you do that? Who's that person that just walked in the room? Why are you making that decision? Then you can really start to dig in and find out a lot of information that you wouldn't have found otherwise. And indeed, occasionally literal apprenticeship is the best way to make this happen. So there's a famous story, one of the early successes of the contextual inquiry model was that bread machines were wildly unpopular in the United States because they made crappy bread. And so a company that, in Japan actually, that wanted to build better bread machines decided to go out and just like watch people building bread. And they sent their like 3 lead engineers to just go become like artisanal bakers. And they were gone for like a year. Like they went and they like worked at a bakery for a year and became like master Japanese bakers. And then they came back to the company and they were like, yeah, you guys have no idea how to make bread. Like, that's why your bread machine sucks. And so they sat down and they like made a new bread machine that was based on this like literal year of time that they had spent out learning how to make bread. And this is kind of not dissimilar from what I did as a PhD student here, actually. While I was working on my dissertation, I spent like the first 2 years of my graduate career becoming an expert in educational technology. Not necessarily because I wanted to be an educator myself. Like I took tons of education classes, but not because I wanted to become a high school teacher, but because I wanted to build tools for high school teachers, tools for college professors. And so I did this like 2-year-long contextual inquiry process where I became an expert in that field and then got serious about building tools for them. So it is possible. The principles here, I can just kind of go through really quickly. They're in the reading. But basically, you want to be where the actual work is happening. So there's this principle of context. You don't just interview somebody in your lab. You don't just interview somebody in the abstract. You actually go where the work is being done and talk to them about how it works. You want details, not just summaries. You want to actually see artifacts that are being passed back and forth between people. And when you see something that you don't understand, you want to stop them and actually get them to tell you about it. There's this relationship between you and the person you're working with that is master-apprentice plus intermittent probing. You don't want to slip into this interviewee model or expert novice or guest host. You really want them teaching you to do their job. Can you imagine a social concern with this process? Yeah.
What if their job is like security?
Yeah, all right. So there are some jobs that people are actually sensitive about telling you about for any number of good reasons. That is a concern. Agreed. Yeah. Yeah, so there's this like social awkwardness where people feel like you're trying to learn how to do my job so that you can replace me with a piece of technology. And it's really hard to kind of convince people, no, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make you better at your job, not I'm trying to replace you with a piece of technology. It's a complicated problem and one that comes up every day in my job. Yeah.
I think in comparison to like an interview, I don't think you can get as much of a one-on-one experience with them. Like they'll probably be able to give more detailed information.
It's kind of okay though. Like you're not their sole attention, but you're not supposed to be their sole attention. Like you don't want them focusing on you. You want them focusing on what they're doing, and you're just there to kind of capture that. Yeah. Yeah, it's a little fuzzier. I see the expert-novice relationship as more of a teaching. So like you and I right now have a kind of expert-novice relationship, but we don't have a master-apprentice relationship in that I'm not sitting here doing what I actually do for a living and letting you kind of interrupt and ask me questions about it. I would call expert-novice almost more student-teacher, teacher-student. So an obvious question is why not just do interviews? Here's a little short video about that question.
This guy's name is Steve, and this guy's name is Mike. They're cousins. They design toys. And so many years ago, they sent us this prototype. And instantly we saw this, and I was like, this is so ingenious. But we needed to test the theory. So we're going to get a bunch of users, and we ask them the question, what's wrong with your measurement? And they'll say, oh, well, it's glass, it breaks. If it drops, it breaks. When my hands are greasy, they're slippery. When I heat things up, they get hot. I said, okay, well, anything else? No, we're happy otherwise. Okay, show us how you measure. So they pour, they bend down, hit it. Pour some more in, bend down, hit it. Pour some out, like 4 or 5 times. All right, nobody mentioned this as a problem. Because this is an accepted part of the process of measuring, right? End of that. And we're happy when we see this kind of problem, this clear inefficiency that nobody articulates. So this is a cup we made. You stand there, you pour to a certain line, and you stop, and that's it. So we sold a couple million units of this in the first 18 months. There's no word required, and there's this pet peeve there that people don't realize that they have, and they get it, and they get the pet peeves and the solution at the same time. And those are the best kind of products for us. And I've shown you these because it does not require, special training or educations or whatever degrees that you have to invent things. It requires keen observations to people's problems and the confidence that you can come up with a solution, to get it done. And
so this is getting at this notion of like, people aren't very good at articulating their own problems, but somebody with good design instincts and good insight can sit there and watch somebody and really quickly glean what the issues are. Just to wrap this up, the last 2 principles are interpretation. So you are there not just to see what is happening, but to interpret, to figure out where the problems are and to devise potential solutions. But as long as you're there, you might as well be kind of cross-checking your interpretations with the person you're interviewing. The last principle is focus. So trying to kind of steer the interactions between you and the user and their environment to things that would actually be useful for you in that time. And then the rest of this we can kind of cover when we get back to user studies. But bottom line is make friends with people. It's really hard to do contextual inquiry with people that hate you. Record everything, and then really work at this staying in character in this master-apprentice sort of model. So with that, I will bid you adieu, and I will see you all next Thursday.